Hey, everybody, welcome to All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About. In this episode, we're going to talk about the Bible. How many of you are intimidated by the Bible? Maybe you've looked at it before and thought, where in the world do I even start? What is this thing all about? Is it true? Can I trust it? Do I want to trust it? Do I even care? Why do people make such a big deal out of it? And did you know that throughout all of history, the Bible is the number one best-selling book, still holds that record. And it's the book that more people on this planet have read than any other book. And you got to just ask yourself, is there something behind it? Is there something to it? In this episode, we kind of break it down a little bit and we kind of explore some of those questions. We also talk about how do you kind of figure out what to do with it, right? There's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament. What does that even mean? And what's the significance of each of those? And so, for those of you who are kind of looking at the Bible thinking, man, that's a lot, it's intimidating, we hope that this simplifies things for you a little bit so that if you have any desire to kind of give it a shot, maybe you'll have a little bit more insight to be able to look inside and not feel quite so lost. So this is our episode, All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About, where we unpack the Bible. By the way, if you like this particular podcast in this format, the religious kind of conversations are just some of the conversations that are a part of the All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast. There's several other episodes that are put together by Rob Byrds, where he interviews other guests about a whole bunch of different topics. And so I've just compiled these because these are the ones that I'm part of the conversation in. And I like to share these with friends who have questions about the projects that I'm working on. But I really encourage you to go to tabootalkback.com, where you can find the rest of Rob's episodes and all of these other conversations about all of these intriguing things that we're not really supposed to talk about, at least people say. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this episode and this conversation with Rob Byrds, Amanda Jones, and myself.
Welcome to All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast. This podcast will explore all the subjects that make the insecure squirm in their seats. Religion, politics, local and national, the Constitution of the United States, and the Wheel of Love and Hate, to just name a few. Stay with us as we use our freedom of speech to delve into the good and the bad. If this podcast is not for you, feel free to find another one. Without any further ado, here comes All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast. All right. Welcome, everybody, to another edition of All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About. We got Mylan Bittenbender here in the studio. Good day to you.
What up?
Amanda Jones is in the studio. Good day to you.
Good day to you.
Yes, and
everybody.
And everybody out there. And we'd like to take the opportunity to say, please share, subscribe, pass us along, tell us all about. You can get on anywhere and leave us a comment and tell us what you think. And of course, we're on Rumble now.
Sweet.
I've started putting this stuff on Rumble, so you can check us out there. Another great place to do so. So welcome to all of our Rumble listeners. I put most of them up so far. Got a few more, and then as we do one, I will continue to put them up. Rumble, YouTube, and then of course everywhere else where you can get podcasts, you can listen to what we're doing. And kind of strange, Mylan, the last few weeks there's been a little like China, like for the radio show. My last month, I getting a lot of downloads from China.
Yeah.
This one, we're getting almost as many downloads in California as we are here in Michigan.
Wow.
It's kind of, there's almost the tail between the two podcasts is, I don't know, it's really kind of way different when I look at the stats and the analytics of it. But regardless of all that, things are going pretty well, and we're certainly enjoying doing these podcasts. So, like I said, please like, share, subscribe, and do all those things and help us reach more people, because we're having fun, and hopefully we can give out some good information and make you think also. So, all right, well, here's how I'm going to start this conversation today. I've had a friend, we're talking about this podcast and some of the things that we were doing here on All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About. And tabootalkback.com is the website, which I forgot. Yeah, thank you. I forgot to say that. And we're talking about these podcasts that we've been doing. They're like really interesting because it's kind of people that are searching and got someone who has, who also is very knowledgeable about the Bible and religion. And we're, like Amanda and I are just kind of searching and asking questions in that sort of way. But we were talking about Genesis and some of the other other books of the Bible, the Old Testament. She goes, well, that's the Old Testament. And I'm like, okay, so what do you mean? What the New Testament? What's the difference? I mean, obviously there's the Old Testament, there's the New Testament. And I guess my limited knowledge of it is kind of like the Old Testament was more of the written word of God, where the New Testament is kind of where Jesus comes in, and there's more of a it's more modern. Okay, I would say, but that's really about all I know. And I think a lot of those books out of the New Testament were written by the apostles. Mm-hmm. They had big hands into that, and obviously the apostles weren't around during the Old Testament. So, what is really the major difference? And I guess what's the first difference in kind of chronological time between the Old Testament and New Testament?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. There's about 400 years between the last part of what we read in the Old Testament and the New Testament. There's a pretty good gap in there. There's a span of time where there wasn't anybody writing. As a matter of fact, they call it kind of a silent time. It wasn't that God was silent, but he wasn't choosing to speak through people during that time. And so, we've got the Old Testament. It basically is everything before Christ. The New Testament is the life of Christ. And so it's kind of dividing line.
I was pretty close.
Yep. AD, BC, BC, AD, that dividing line is kind of the dividing line between, Old Testament, the history and the writings from before Christ, and then the New Testament was written after Christ.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but during that time, isn't there speculation that there were writings that were like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Book of Enoch or something in there? Yeah,
part of the problem, right, is what is true scripture and what's not. What has because people have been writing stuff forever, right? And so which things make it into the scriptures? And I don't want to get into all of the details of that, but there's a certain list of criteria that were used to determine which scriptures would make it into what we call the canon. The canon is the actual collection, the 66 books of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay.
So now, when they say that, why would they say something like that to me when I would say, well, that's the Old Testament? What would you infer from that question?
Well, it depends on the person and what they've been taught and all of that. But there seems to be there's a change and yet there's not, right? So part of what really is beautiful about Old Testament and New Testament literature when you put them together is they actually work off of one another. Mm-hmm. So the Old Testament gives us a view and a preview of what is coming. And the New Testament definitely reaches back to what had been. A lot of people don't realize Jesus was a Jewish man. He was thoroughly Jewish. And he came to live out the Jewish faith, but then ultimately to fulfill the things that were written about him, or the things that God had predicted, the plan that God was working out through the Jewish people.
Wow, Amanda.
So you said there was a 400 years between the two books.
Yeah, I think it was that,
or around there. Yeah, but there was definitely a few centuries.
There was a gap.
Why? You said God wasn't silent, but he wasn't speaking to the people. Why?
Well, I can't answer for God on the why front.
Right.
But a lot of what was happening in Jewish history. So, when you read back through the Old Testament, what you'll find is, it starts with creation, and then it goes briefly through this long history, a couple thousand years of just basically how mankind reproduced and grew, and the civilizations that grew up, and then we find the flood of Noah, right? And God really having to deal with all of the evil in the world, and so we have Noah's flood, and then shortly after that we see the repopulation of the earth and all of that, and then we come into the story of this man named Abraham. Abraham was a man that God chose through him to begin what we would consider the Jewish race, the Hebrew race, and then from there forward, we're reading about the Jewish people, and ultimately everything from how that family grew to they went to Egypt, and then were there for 450 years, and then were brought back to the land of Canaan, where what was promised to Abraham, and then out of that began the process toward becoming a nation, and having kings and all of that. I'm getting to your question.
No,
this is
it's
a long
helpful.
answer.
It's helpful.
I thought you were doing the politician thing for a minute.
No, I'm getting
going around it. No, I knew you were.
I'm a terrible politician.
Because it should make the break make sense.
Yeah. So then we run through, what we see of the Jewish nation, the rise and fall of different kings and all of that, the splitting of Israel and Judah and all of that. And then what happens just before that gap is that God has to judge his nation, the Jewish people, and they're actually exiled to a country called Babylon. And then they're exiled for 70 years. And then when they come back, the Jewish kingdom as it was before, with the kings and a very established kingdom, never really is reestablished. So for that time gap, the Jewish people are just kind of there, but there's not the strong national sense of nation that there was before the exile. So during that time, the temple has been destroyed. Now it's been rebuilt, but it's not the same.
Right.
And so there's a lot of things in that time that make it difficult for the people. They're struggling with their identity. They're struggling with having this what we call a theocracy, a nation that's governed by a theology and that kind of thing. And so the people are just kind of, for several hundred years, just kind of trying to figure out what's next.
Just
and
milling
really,
about. Huh?
Yeah, just kind of doing life.
In limbo.
Yep, kind of in limbo. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, and they felt like God had kind of abandoned them. And that's why when Jesus shows up on the scene, right, after this long period of silence, it was an amazing resurgence of faith and an amazing thing that was happening there.
I'm gonna shift gears for just a second, because you're talking about the Jewish faith and the Jewish people. Where did that originate? And because a lot of people don't know, they say, these people, they're Jews. And even now it seems, although we can say that he's a Jew or he's a Jew, to me back in the day it seemed like that was like saying a bad word. That was like saying the N-word. If you said that person's a Jew, that was like calling them the N-word.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's not the case anymore. Is that because we have laxed, or is that still, does Jewish people, if someone says, oh, he's a Jew, feel that way? Because that used to have some kind of a connotation that went with that.
It might be interesting to get into an entire podcast episode about that, about the Jewish history. I'm going to start by giving a little bit of information about the now and kind of where we're at now, but then go back and give a little bit of the history. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, because it's kind of it really is, setting the table for Jesus's life, who was a Jew.
Right. So one of the things that we find very interesting about the Jews that people either celebrate or they absolutely despise is that the Jewish people, there is some kind of thing with them. They are an incredibly successful people. Now, we might look at what is happening in the world and go, well, they kind of don't show up that much. But if we look at all of the, not all of it, but many of the measurables, Like, for example, how many Nobel Prizes have been won by Jewish people? It's like 35, 40%. And when you look at how they do in sports, when you look at how powerful they are military-wise as a nation, when you look at how many patents are held by Jewish people, how many Jewish people are doctors and lawyers, very, very successful, very wealthy people, all of these kinds of things, it's incredibly disproportionate because they make up less than 1% of the world's population. And yet a huge percentage of them would be at the top of these, these things. So it's like there's some kind of blessing on this race of people, which if you don't like them, that makes you hate them even more.
Right.
If you're on their side, you're kind of like going, I kind of want to hang with these people because there's something on them, right? A blessing of some sort. Well, it goes all the way back to this guy, I mentioned him already, Abraham. You can read about this early on in Genesis. And God chooses this man, Abraham. And you'd have to read it to understand kind of what was going on there. But, it's not just God picked this guy out of the crowd, but God put a kind of a test before him and invited him into a relationship with him. And it was a faith-based relationship. It wasn't something that Abraham could do to prove his worth. It was all about, would he trust God with his life? And even the life of his son. If you've heard the story of Abraham and Isaac, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac on the altar. And Abraham went all the way to the point of drawing the knife. And God stepped in and said, okay, I get it. You do trust me and you'll do anything for our relationship. And God promised Abraham that he would bless him. And now here's the part that's really, really important is that God said, I will bless you so that you will be a blessing to the rest of the world. God basically was saying, I want to reveal myself to humankind through someone. And this story is about how God chose that someone and how that relationship developed. And so Abraham, him and his wife had Isaac, who had Jacob, and from there we get the 12 tribes of Israel, and we get the story that basically rolls out to become the nation of Israel, the Jewish people. Does that answer your question?
It does. Well, and if anything, it gives some background to who and why they came about. And I think it would be a great podcast to talk more about the religion and their beliefs. Because obviously, I mean, they have Hanukkah, which is different than, that's very specific to the Jewish religion. Yeah. And many different things like that. So I think that would be really cool to talk about, because I think a lot of people out there really don't know what it is to be Jewish. And then when you talk about that, that's just not monolithic. They're not, he's Jewish, so they're all like this. There are so many different, Hasidic Jews. There's the Eastern, the different Orthodox. There's all kinds of.
There didn't used to be all of that. Unfortunately, I think that's a lot of the factioning. Or
that's happened to our church too. To every religion, it
always happens. It always happens.
Nobody seems to get along, and we have to. One has to go one way, one has to go. They come the first Church of God. That one's now the second Church of God, and this. Well, no, I'm done with you. We're going to go be the third Church of God.
I think a lot too is they reinvest in themselves.
Sure.
I know in the Mormon religion, there's a lot of, you use the Mormon companies for the church service for like, oh, we need a new carpet. Let's find somebody who's a part of our faith and bless them. They bless us. It's that kind of a thing.
Well, with all that being said, just as there are a lot of Jewish people that don't seem to be blessed in that same way.
Yes and no. So part of what's happened, the Jewish people used to be, and you could say this about Christians or anybody, but used to be much more tied. Like I said, when the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon, one of the things that happened is King Nebuchadnezzar came in and basically destroyed everything, destroyed their culture, the temple, all of that. And from that point forward, it became much more difficult for them to live out the religious faith that God had put in place, because like you said, the holidays were and the worship at the temple and all of those things were structured in a certain way, and all of that was kind of broken after that. And part of that whole, being in limbo time was where a lot of that factioning or fracturing came from, because now they weren't as unified by those things that had held strong. And once all that was broken, now, all of these different groups began to kind of move in their own little bit different directions. Yeah. So, and that, that always happens when you put religion into the hands of men. And that's one thing that we always have to be careful of. It comes back to, where does this all flow from? Does it come from tradition and other people and my own thoughts and my
Everybody
tribe?
that writes has a bias.
Right. Yeah.
To how you write and how you think.
Yeah.
And over the years with the Bible, it's been passed down from generation to generation, from edition to edition. And it's almost, to me, over those years, it's almost the dumbing down of the Bible. Make it more simple for people to understand. Is that true, or is that a misconception?
Most of the versions that we have are still very accurate. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that Christians would say is a strong point in our faith, is that the Bible is still a really reliable standard. As a matter of fact, you talked about the different versions. The different versions have come about mostly as different individuals' ways to communicate to a changing society. Not changing in values and beliefs and morals, but changing in, for example, the King James Version was written in the common language of that day. Well, we don't speak in these and thous and all that stuff anymore. So you read that to somebody nowadays and they're just lost.
Yeah.
The meaning of the, let's say, the NIV or the ESV or some of those other more modern versions is still very, very, very close. But it's written
just
in
kind of the vernacular,
like the NIV is written at an 8th grade level, reading level.
Well, and if you want our people in the United States to read it, that's where you have to write.
Right.
That's
exactly.
where our education level is.
If you want people to understand it and be able to absorb it. So, and some things have happened. You mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls. What was the deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls? That was a discovery in, I think the 1970s.
It wasn't, I think, in the 70s.
Yeah. In a cave, right? Some kid, I guess, shooting rocks with a slingshot or something into a cave, heard breaking pottery. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And they go in there and they find these, all this pottery full of these old scrolls, and they date them back, and they find out these scrolls, some of them, because back then they didn't have computers that, if I print out a doc for you and I print the same doc out a month later for you, it's going to be exactly the same, right? Whereas back then they had to hand write all of these copies. So one of the big questions has always been, how accurate is that? If you're handwriting copy after copy after copy after copy.
Sure.
Well, when you date something back even closer to the time of the original writing, and you find that it's identical to what was found, that's hundreds of years older, it increases the reliability of that text. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls were able to help us dial our original manuscripts back even farther, closer to the actual time of the events that they record, and they were, it was shocking to see how close they were to documents that we had that had been copied hundreds of years later. So, and those are all the kinds of things. Obviously, those were all discovered since the King James Version was written. So there were a few minor changes that have been made, and they would say, because the older documents have this or don't have this, they are a more reliable source. And so there were a few things that were changed from the King James Version, but very, like less than 0.5% of the content has been adjusted in any way. And so the rest of it is all just putting it into modern vernacular, and a lot of times even a modern perspective, so that people can understand what the scriptures are saying.
Yeah. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they all have chapters, I believe. Yep. But I think probably for most people, where they identify the most when it comes to the New Testament is Psalms and Proverbs. Do you agree with that?
Now, those are in the Old Testament.
Those are, yeah. Really?
Both of them. Yep.
Okay, so that I'm going to go back and I'm going to cut that straight out of this podcast. So
it's okay.
So what?
Here's why you're thinking that, because a lot of times they would, in order to simplify and have a smaller book for people,
right?
They would give, you could buy just the New Testament, but they would throw Psalms and Proverbs into that, because those are very
all right. Now I don't feel
books.
Like such a dummy.
No, you're not a dummy.
I might just keep this just because of that answer.
I made it possible. Answer some people's questions.
Yeah. Okay,
like, wait, it's in mine.
All right. So what other than Revelation? What do you think are the most popular books in the New Testament?
Well, honestly, a lot of that depends on where you're at in this whole process. If you're in a discovery phase, then you're gonna find a lot more connection in the actual stories of Jesus' life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got what we call the 4 Gospels. I don't like that they call it that, simply from the standpoint that most people don't know what the heck the word gospel means. So all of a sudden it just sounds big and religious. Really, the word gospel means the good news. And the good news is that God loved a lost and broken and sinful people, and was willing to send his own son to give his life as a sacrifice on our behalf, so that we could be forgiven and we could be reconciled to God, right? Yeah. We could be made right with him. So that story is written 4 different times from 4 different authors: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody new to this whole idea, just kind of checking things out, they're really going to kind of connect with that. After the 4 Gospels is the book of Acts. It's the Acts of the Apostles and in the early church, and it's basically the story of what happened after Jesus is resurrected and ascended to heaven, and what the church does after that, what the people of God do after that, how the church grows, and how they respond to the world around them and everything else. And then after that are what we call the epistles. And those are written, like you said, by the apostles.
Yeah.
And these are all the books that deal a lot with, these are more content in nature. And they deal with, okay, how do we live out this faith? Or how do we embrace these beliefs? And what does this all mean for our lives?
Yeah. Yeah, and as you talk, it's kind of, I have flashes of other stories in the Bible. Zacchaeus.
Yep. That's New Testament.
That's New Testament. But then because I don't know, a lot of people think differently. And, over the years, I see these stories in my head. I see Abraham putting his son on the altar and getting ready to sacrifice with the knife up and ready to plunge the knife into his son. And God says, stop. I see it. I can see all that. That's just because I'm a visual learner that way.
Yeah.
So to see the stories and see, Zacchaeus up in a tree, the tax collector, and God saying, just come on down. I don't know. I see all that. And the one thing that I don't see nearly as much is Revelation, is that last book, which that's certainly probably a whole podcast series in itself.
Yeah.
But to be the end book in the end times, why was it chosen to be part of the Bible?
Well, it cleared those requirements that I was talking about in order to be, it was written by John. Jesus had 12 disciples. He had 3 of those 12 disciples were particularly close. They're in all the stories because they were like his inner 3, and John was one of those inner 3, and he was very close to Jesus.
Which was the one who betrayed Jesus?
That was Judas.
It was Judas. That's right. Okay.
Yeah. Yep. He wasn't part of the inner 3.
He wasn't part of the inner circle. It would have been almost. It would almost be a better story if he was.
Yeah.
But
more interesting. Maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Judas was actually the keeper of the money. for the group. So that may tell you a little bit about just the problem that money brings to just about any situation. Right. But anyway, so Revelation is written by John, and here's all of the other apostles had been martyred for the faith. That's one of the things that makes the story so believable or reliable. Right. These 12 people, they were there. Yeah. I mean, they saw it. Who is going to lay down their life for a lie?
Right.
Nobody. I will make great sacrifices if it will promote me in order to, and I'll hang on to a lie to do that. But to die for a lie, for a lie, nobody's doing that, right? Let alone 12 people. Actually, there was way more than that. Those were just the 12 apostles. So John was actually the only apostle who was not martyred for his faith, but he was exiled to basically a prison island, the island of Patmos, and so he obviously ended up dying. He was boiled, burned parts of his body as part of punishment for being a follower of Jesus. So I mean, he was a martyr in the sense that he's tortured, and all of that, and of course put on a prison island. And so John wrote Revelation as a revelation. That's what it means. A revelation that God gave him of what was to come, and he sent that to the churches of the day, and that became a very important part.
Was that meant as a warning, or this is what's going to happen, or was it this is a warning to you that if you don't change your ways and you don't find a better way to do things, this is what's going to happen?
There are some warnings in there, absolutely. He challenges each of the 7 churches that he sent this to, or there were 7 churches that were kind of the larger, more influential churches of the day, and Jesus speaks to each one of those churches, and there's always a warning in there. That, if you don't persist or if you don't stand strong, this kind of thing. So there are some warnings in there. There's also just some beautiful images of what the heavenly realm is like, right? What is it like in heaven? What's it like in the throne room of God? There's also what I would call preparation, for somebody who's going to be going. I do believe that there's going to be, what we call tribulation or difficult times at the end here, as history as we know it here is kind of wrapping up. And there's a lot of things in there that I think are going to be important as Christians begin to see that time draw near, to say, hey, you know what? Times are crazy. Yeah. But I know where this is headed. Yeah. Yeah. And it gives us courage to hang in there.
But it's such an interpretive book. And it's,
that's why I hesitated to jump into it earlier.
and we're not going to go much further than this. We'll go back a ways and hit a couple of those books. But, when it being interpretive is what I said. Back in 1989, I do believe one of the 4 horsemen was Gorbachev with his scar on his forehead. They're all coming. So that was 35 years ago.
I wish,
and it hasn't happened, or was that actually part of it? We're just still in the middle of Revelation happening. Well, what's the deal?
Sometimes it's embarrassing being a Christian. Never because of what God has done or what Christ said or what he did, but because of what us sometimes lame followers have done. And we're all to blame. I'm not perfect either, but sometimes we stick our necks out there and we say stupid things, and we just blow it. We miss
it's coming to an end every now and again.
Well, sure, it is coming to an end. Is that end, next week, or is it 100 years away?
For every beginning, there is an end. Yes, right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But so, it honestly aggravates me every time somebody lines up all these things and says, here it is, here's the key, I've figured it out, here's all the puzzle together, and this is what's going to happen, and it never happens, and we look like a bunch of idiots.
Yeah.
This is something I just talked to my dad about today. Like, as we were growing up, they would always tell us, you're the chosen generation, like you're this, you're all these things. And now as an adult, I'm looking and I see all the rest of my peers in my age bracket and where they're at and how lost they are or how found some of them still are and all these different degrees. And I look at that and I look at my kids and I feel that now. But as a kid, people are saying things and you're just like, oh, okay, whatever. I just want to go home. But now as an adult, I'm looking and I'm like, I don't know if my kids have the tools they need. And I wonder if my generation has failed these generations below following the ways of the world versus, church and religion and just spirituality in general. Yeah,
I fear that our generation is biblically illiterate, and previous
when you
generations.
Say our,
to
are you
some
talking
degree,
Generation X?
Gen X.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but I think the generation before us, I think every generation gets a little less, biblically savvy,
a little further away.
Yeah, the problem is we are just too darn busy. We have way too much going on in our lives. We don't know the scriptures. And if we don't know the scriptures ourselves, we can't pass them on. And of course, I'm sure there's somebody who's listening who's going, yeah, the scriptures, big deal. They're not that important. Or that as a follower of Jesus Christ, to me, they are the cornerstone of what we do have to understand, to hang on to, that gives us the insights that we need to know to live right. That's my perspective, my opinion.
Sure.
Right. And going back to, your statement, Amanda, I think it's, we look at the next generation and they probably know even less of the scriptures than we knew. Mm-hmm. And we do see that the farther we get away from the truth that we find in what I believe is God's word, we're going to be farther away from God's original intentions and design for this world and the people he put here. And it's just it's gonna be a bigger mess.
Right. Because then, I have 3 kids. Now, what if they each have 2 or 3 kids and then they don't know and then they have their kids and it's just all this, it's a generations.
So here's something that is hopeful as we look back throughout history, as we find that there were times when interest in following God, reading the word, all of that waned, and then there were times when it resurged. We call them revivals.
Those usually take some kind of an event, do they not, for people to start thinking about it again?
No, they actually result in an event. A revival is usually very grassroots. It's usually something that begins to happen that is you're almost like, where in the world did that come from? All of a sudden, these people over here they're reading their word, they're praying, there's this movement, there's this growth, and then these people over here and these people over here. And then usually what happens is it culminates in some sort of event where we can look and we can say, oh, look, there's revival. We see this thing kind of coming together. And then, based on the time in history, the location and how widespread it is, it could last a few years. And we see this big, huge resurgence where hundreds or even thousands of people are affected and this great movement. And I believe there was somewhat of a revival that led to the birth of America.
Sure.
Because we know that America was founded on Christian principles by a group of people who were very devoted to the Christian faith. Yeah. And then goes back to what we said a little bit ago. Then we start putting religion all over it.
Yeah.
And we kind of like put a wet blanket on
and that's
God wants to do.
And I don't know if you quite understood what I meant by an event. Okay. Talking about, let's even go back into Native American history a little bit. Mm-hmm. A meteor comes. Next, they say that, and then it's some exalted thing. It's a God who is sending us this and that. That's kind of what maybe it starts small and grassroots, and I believe that most movements do. Yeah. But it's some kind of like an event that happened, like there was someone died, but they came back. They saw the light and came back. Yeah. Or an event where like a meteor or some kind of a natural disaster or some kind of something that looks like a miracle. Yeah. And that's where that 1 or 2 people have that spark, and then it starts to build from that.
Well, you mentioned China a little while ago, and there is actually a huge Christian movement in China right now, massive. You're not going to hear about it.
Is there a government trying to stop that?
Absolutely, and that's part of the reason. We people love to rebel.
Yeah.
And
it is in our nature.
Yeah. Going back though to what you just mentioned, kind of an event, there's also a thing happening in the Middle East among Muslims, where Muslims are having visions of Jesus coming to them, either in dreams or in daytime visions. Thousands of Muslims are reporting that they are being visited by Jesus. and so many of these are disconnected, and so it's not like this, like group, mass.
Right. There's no like
delusion.
Facebook group.
It's not
they
like
all
a mass
belong
delusion.
To.
These people are disconnected from other happenings like this, and like going, this thing happened, and oh my gosh, my life has changed. So
wow.
Yes, so sometimes it is events like that, and there are some, and one of the things that's important for us as Americans to know, because we see a gross decline in religion, especially Christianity here in America, but there are places around the world where it is blowing up, and we don't see that. So we think it's outdated, it's old, it's irrelevant, it doesn't make a difference today. That is all somewhat localized in the sense that that's our local experience. So that's the perception we have.
Well, how do you bring it back to the insensitive? And I mean, because most people have done that before. I've heard about that. It's been there. It's nothing new to me. How do you get people that feel that way to be re-energized within it?
So there's two things I think about. A lot of times that's what church is trying to do, and trying too hard.
Yeah.
People are trying. That's never going to work, because true Christianity is something that happens in the human soul. It's not a group event. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
You can't manufacture it. You can't make it happen. Faith happens in the soul. So I think, sometimes we're trying to make revival happen, and that's never going to happen.
Yeah.
The way revival comes is when people just, a lot of times groups of people go through such hardship that they are humbled enough that their eyes are simply, they quit putting their faith in all of these other quote unquote gods that have failed them, and they're open. Yeah. Their spirit is open to something that God wants to do.
I think that being humble part plays a big role into it.
And unfortunately, us Americans are just too stinking successful.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? We have too much. We're spoiled. We're entitled. Mm-hmm. And true, honest, sincere faith really struggles to grow in that kind of environment. Because we're our own gods. What do we need God for?
Mm-hmm. Very true.
I have a crazy question for you. And man, you've probably never been asked a question like this. And if you haven't, then good for me. If you were to, we got the New Testament and you got the Old Testament, or the way I put it, the Old Testament and the New Testament. If you were tasked with never teaching one of the testaments ever again and talking about it, and say you have to decide no, I will never talk about the New Testament again, or I will never talk about the Old Testament again. Which one holds more weight for you? Bam.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
I will say it's not the first time I've heard it, but
okay,
it's rare. It's a rare question, but it's a really good question. It goes back, Amanda, I can't remember if this was before we started this podcast in our little discussion, or if it was after we started, but you talked about a friend who said, oh, that's Old Testament.
That was Rob.
Was that Rob?
Yeah, it was me. That was my good friend Angel. How are you? Shout out, Angel.
So sometimes people might, kind of like as if what's in the Old Testament is irrelevant, right? So you even posing that question makes me think, oh, you can't, both of them serve such an important purpose. However, I would say this, that people today are ultimately going to find God in the New Testament, through the life and the teaching of Jesus, and through the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God actually engaging with people. So I do believe from that standpoint that the New Testament is more, I will say, relevant but you have to have the witness of the Old Testament to give credence to the New Testament.
It's almost about saying, our last 30 years of American history are really the most relevant thing that, most important thing that we ever did. Everything before that really kind of doesn't have any weight anymore. And it's hard to do that kind of thing. And I get what you're saying, because everything in the New Testament is based on the Old Testament teachings.
Yeah. But if you think about, if you're talking about government and the way we are as Americans, it always comes back to the beginning, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. It always does kind of draw its way back, and it's so simple and done. There's not really much argument.
Well, and the whole reason for the Europeans to leave Europe and come here was for that same thing. The religion is behind everything, it seems.
Yeah. Well, and I'm seeing yard signs for a particular political party that say we're not going back. And to me, I'm going, what are we running from? We've become the most successful nation on the planet in about 100 different ways. Mm-hmm. And why this whole we're not going back? That shows me that a certain group of individuals have said what happened before doesn't matter. We don't like it. It doesn't apply. We've got new plans. We got new ideas. We're going to fix this mess. When we lose, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's your family, whether it's your business, whether it's a country. When you lose your foundation, where you came from, what everything is built on, you're in trouble. Let me say, you're not necessarily in trouble, but you will lose what you have, and you hope that what you gain is better. Most of the time, it's not.
Right. Because you're destroying your foundation.
Yeah.
You have to build from the bottom up again, in a way.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's my opinion.
Well, and and when we say that, that's what's kind of, when it comes to the Word of God and anybody that's a scholar of it, everything they tell you is actually their opinion.
Yeah.
They've been taught by people. They've been taught by what they've read.
Right.
They've been taught by circumstances in their life. But regardless, it's still just an opinion until he shows up on your doorstep and says everything they said is true. Are you ready to go with me? Then you'll never know. It's all just an opinion.
That's right. Yeah. And we do have to understand, we have to be very, very careful to be humble enough to say, this is my perception based on what I read and what I see.
Yeah.
Right. But you ask the question, could you give up the Old Testament? Well, if you give up the Old Testament, you give up creation.
Yeah.
And then the New Testament doesn't matter because we're just a bunch of random mistakes that happened here anyway. Who cares if there's a
people
Jesus
flying around in space, all going all over the place.
Well, then you go to creation too. It's a simple story.
Yeah.
There's not paragraphs and just chapters on one part of it's all one chapter. I think it was the whole creation.
Yeah. And then how do you throw out the 10 Commandments?
Right.
I mean, our entire system of law are really built on that.
Yep.
And not just our system of law, but morality is built on that.
Yeah.
Which, through the course of time, people have lost that morality and it's been gained back.
And they've added things too.
Yeah. And and it's kind of one of those tidal waves that, ebbs and flows.
Yep.
But and to me, that was really fascinating when you're talking about in other parts of the world that Christianity is thriving and growing. Where are those places and why?
Africa, India, China.
Is that missionary work doing that? Is that...
Interestingly enough, there are so many stories of places where we sent missionaries who worked for years and years and years with very little result.
Yeah.
And then when those missionaries were kicked out, it was almost like that was a spark that really ignited.
It ain't true until you leave.
Well, we don't appreciate it until we don't have it in our. I think that's one of the things that's going to happen to America. We're going to have to get to the point where we see what happens when we completely abandon the truth of the Word of God. And then we've got to kind of go through that to develop a hunger for it.
Sure. Well,
Mylon, do you think that in America there needs to be more of our own missionary work, within our own communities, or? Because
we've all, quote unquote, heard the story. We've heard at least different versions of it. The name Jesus is not some, new idea to us. I think we just need honest, genuine, real people who are living the faith to be honest, genuine, and real.
Mm-hmm.
I to me, we don't need to be preached at more. We don't need more missionaries to preach at us. We need more individuals who just will live the life and do so with integrity.
And I think even when I've had my issues with religion, I always go back to these certain people that just have that pure heart.
Mm-hmm.
And they follow, I don't want to say they follow blindly, but they have that testimony, personal testimony, and their faith and all of these things. And they're just good people. And I always just look at them and I'm like, oh, I aspire to be like this person when I grow up, kind of a thing. But so it's hard to always say, oh, religion's bad, because I think of these good people that have been put in my life, guided me, especially when I was in the military. I would go to church and I had not generals, but like colonels and high ranking military people looking out for me, just little basic airmen. And they were kind. There's that Christian love. There was that they were just good people. And it's hard for me to always be like, oh, Christians, this and that. Because I always just remember the ones that were so loving and kind and good to me. Yeah. And I may not have or still agree with everything, but I know that the content of these people's characters are very good.
My challenge to everyone is to really be careful not to get wrapped up in how Christianity is displayed through people. Because you're going to see that. You're going to see people that you look and you go, it is real. I mean, that's a powerful expression of it. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to be blown away by how many people claim to be Christians that you don't want to have anything to do with whatever they got.
I think they're giving everybody a bad name in a way.
And that's part of the reason the Gospels are so important, is because I don't want people to look at my life. I don't want them to even listen to what I have to say. If I can do anything, I want to point them to the words and the life, the actions of Jesus himself.
Yeah.
You can't find fault there. You just can't.
So it's almost
people
like
can't find fault.
You have to almost redirect them, just like with government issues, redirect them to the Constitution, to the Declaration. Exactly. And it's like, if they're like, well, you're this, redirect them toward the teachings of Jesus.
The Bible describes Jesus as the perfect image or the perfect representation of God. In Colossians, it talks about. And if we can look at Jesus and see what God is like, those people that are quote unquote sold, that have that blind faith, whatever, that are just totally sold out, that's what they've seen.
And people are like, when going back into my past, but like everyone's like, oh, you're an atheist now. And it's like, no, because I do believe Jesus was a good person. I believe he was a real person, and I believed he did good things, and it ticked the wrong people off. Obviously, he was some sort of I don't want to say he was a troublemaker, but the things he was teaching and doing were not the way things were. So it's a little different.
Draw some correlations to today's world. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
No, but it's true.
The most hated people are the ones that usually are probably telling the most truths.
Right. Because they upset the control and the power that certain people have. Jesus, 100%, Jesus was killed out of jealousy. Yeah. The people who were in power, who used this theocracy, this religious governmental system to control the people. Jesus can't, and he didn't even have to say anything bad about him. He wasn't like our current politicians he didn't have to call them names, didn't have to call them out, didn't have to be mean. He was such a bright light in the midst of it all that everybody starts looking at him going, now that guy's got the answer. And all the religious leaders are like going, whoa, where are you going? Where are you going? We got the answer. And they were beginning to lose power, lose control of the people. They were starting to lose their influence. And Jesus had to go.
And you just think, what if they were more into the virtues, those leaders, than the 7 sins kind of a thing? Because just going back from that last 2 podcasts we've done, it's really, the 7 virtues really kind of define how Jesus was. And that's the way to live kind of a thing. I just feel like it's a happier, more positive way to live, I guess. And then I just look at everybody in my life, like the people I just kind of talked about that have been around in my life that are Christians, and how good they were. And they really had a lot of those qualities. So it's just, I don't know. It's been a lot to think about for me, at least for the past about 2 months, 3 months that we've been doing this.
Doing this since in July when we launched this podcast.
Yeah. I don't know. It's really changing my perspective on a lot of things again. It's nice.
Yeah, Jesus was so life-giving. That's what I call those virtues. They're life-giving. Mm-hmm. Those are things that when you live in that, when you experience it from another person, when you're in the sphere, you feel alive, you feel free, you feel good.
Yes.
Right? And then when we're in the sphere of those deadly sins, we pursue those things because we think that they're going to do something for us, but then we just feel
it's like a junk food almost. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's like it's a momentary thing, and then afterwards you're like, I'm still starving. Like my soul's still starving.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, now that you guys are all just looking at me like, what's next?
What's next, Rob?
What, Rob?
We're 50-something minutes here. I don't know if we just want to do kind of some closing thoughts or, I think the most, before we end this, one of the most powerful scenes and the powerful stories in the New Testament is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and then when he arose on the third day.
Yeah.
That story alone, to me, is probably one of the why the New Testament for me maybe weighs a little heavier than the Old Testament.
Yeah.
The Old Testament if you have an imagination and you can think of creation being made, you can think of the first blue skies. You can think of Abraham on the mountain and going and chiseling out 10 commandments, maybe 15 as it was in I can't remember what movie that was. That was a Brooks movie or whatever. But yeah. He comes walking out about 15 commandments and drops them. 10 commandments. But those kind of stories and stories of Abraham, the flood, and the giants. Mm-hmm. Those are things that we discuss now when you start talking like Ancient Aliens on History Channel and stuff, where they talk about stuff like that, and there's some kind of a correlation in there with some of those theories to what's going on, especially when they talk about giants, and that our own Smithsonian has had giant bones forever, but they refuse to acknowledge it. Because to acknowledge giants, that's almost to acknowledge the past, which that past is the Bible, which wrote about them. So to say there were giants, then it's like, that's saying that the Old Testament is true. That's really why I believe the Smithsonian is trying to keep that separation between science and religion. But there's crossover there.
Yeah.
And if you don't acknowledge that crossover, it's going to, you're only getting part of the story. Mm-hmm. But, so that the story of Jesus being betrayed, right from the time when he was betrayed, it is, to me, and I certainly haven't been a religious scholar or anything like that, but the story of Jesus Christ is the most significant story of one man that's ever been told.
I mentioned earlier about the quote unquote blessing that seems to rest on the Jewish people. But you could also look at the life of Jesus himself as an individual, and you could think, how in the world could one person, a person who never had a college degree, didn't study at a university, never held any political power whatsoever, never had a title or, was president of this or a senator at that or, anything like that, never had an army at his disposal, never traveled outside of his own homeland, all of these things that never owned a business, all of these things that we would attribute to the great people who've influenced the world, it didn't meet any of those criteria. And yet our calendar is divided by his life. A third of the people on the planet would say that they ascribe to his teachings at some level. Jesus is clearly the most influential human being ever to have lived, just by any measure. And yet he didn't meet up to it. So how do you attribute that? How do you explain that?
Yeah, it's that he met not one of the criteria of success that we have today.
Part of what
other
made
than friends, he He had
he had plenty of enemies too,
and of course plenty of enemies. But that was the success part, was that he had people that wanted to be with him and follow him and listen to his teachings and just be with him.
Yeah.
But that's not any successful benchmark that we have in today's society.
Yeah.
Not even one of them.
Jesus was known for flipping pretty much everything on its head. Anything you would say, this is true, or this is what life is about, or that's the direction we should go, he kept flipping that stuff on its head. And, he was the ultimate rebel. I know that sounds strange, but Jesus was the ultimate. He rebelled against every societal current.
Mm-hmm.
And
I feel like that's very relevant today.
Absolutely. If people want to change, here you go.
Yeah.
I think really truly looking at, don't look at church, don't look at religion, you got to look below those surface things. Like we talked about a few weeks ago, right? All of those things they end up being, even in their best intentions, a copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. Go to the original, go to the source.
Yeah.
Go to the person of Jesus, read about his life, really take it in. Who was this guy? What did he think? How did he respond to other people? What did he stand for? And what was his life about? You start to really look there, and there's some serious substance.
And whether you believe in God, believe in Jesus, I think that most people on this planet, and certainly in the United States, have the capacity to see the difference between good and bad, good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
When you see good, emulate that. When you see evil and you see some of this nastiness that maybe happen on stage these days,
mm-hmm.
And you see lewdness in the park, and you see in California where in San Francisco, as long as you're not committing a sex act, you can walk around nude. And when you see stuff like that, realize that is not good.
Yeah.
And look away from that and see what is good and emulate that. We all have been given, almost all of us are psychopaths and sociopaths that maybe don't have that ability, but almost all of us have that ability to see the difference between good and evil.
Well, to some degree. But what I would say is that to some degree, and we talked about sin, we talked about what sin does. And in Romans, Paul talks about the fact that sin, as a part of our original nature, it's basically a core self-centeredness, will distort that in each one of us. And so what you say is good and what somebody else says is good, those two things are different. And what we've walked away from is a core central goodness that we find in God. And I truly believe, and I think what the Bible teaches us, is that as long as we have a sinful nature intact, we're going to continue to live with some sort of, that's why we all look back and we think, why in the world did I do that? Seemed so right at the time. There's something broken in us that keeps us from getting on the right path and being on the right path. And a huge part of the answer is what God did through Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. That he can come and he can restore that brokenness in the human soul.
Yeah. And with that being said, after we've sucked all the oxygen out of the room, I think it's time we call this one good, and know that we're going to keep coming back, hopefully about every week, being able to release another new podcast, Talking with Mylan, because I think these are incredibly important talks. And I think as time goes on, they're going to catch on. Because we're just, even, Mylan, you know what you're talking about. You are a scholar when it comes to this. But there are so many out there that just would like to know more, and like to know more in a way like this, where they can sit down on the couch and listen to somebody talking about it, and drive the car and listen to somebody talk about it, rather than having to go look at a bunch of faces in a church and say, who are these people? I mean, because when you get around all those people, you people watch, you look, what's this person's deal? What's that? You forget, you don't hear the message.
Start zoning out.
You start zoning out. And, I think everybody that's ever gone to church, if you've gone to church for more than a couple of years, you've fallen asleep. It's happened, and I know it has.
Not me.
I certainly remember the night after prom, because, when we had prom and we had to go to church on Friday. So there's a whole group of us in the front row that all went to prom, and we got our tuxes and everything on, and every one of us is about asleep in the front row. So.
Hey, there's nothing more humbling than being a pastor. I've been a pastor, preaching your heart out and looking up and seeing somebody sleep in the third row.
Yeah.
You created a comfortable environment.
Yeah.
There you go.
And actually, and I know you've preached at Hope before, but I remember those days, and I don't know if they still do it, but they would always look out into the crowd and say, "John Byers, would you like to give a prayer for the church?" And they would stand up and do it.
On the spot?
Oh, yeah, right there. And they never knew who it was going to be. And, and you could just see when it came to that time, every head that's looking at them, all of a sudden their heads go down, their eyes go down. They start looking the other way. Do not make eye contact with them. Do not do it. I got caught like twice in like 2 months.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and I'm like, okay, I'm never coming to church again.
Well, just so you know, they don't do that anymore.
They would always ask before the meetings at my churches.
Yeah.
So I remember that quite vividly, though.
Oh, yeah.
Man, looking at all the heads go down. All right, our prayer of invocation, or whatever they called it. Everybody's heads go down. I'm not looking at them. They're all looking the other way.
Yeah, there's a reason we don't do that anymore.
Yes, and sometimes I will say church certainly can be fun.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
And, the best part of it, even though I said a lot of people would like to listen to this kind of stuff on their own and not be around a bunch of people, but really a very, very important part of church is the other people you go with.
Yeah, the fellowship.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, no doubt about it. So, all right, all the things they don't want you to talk about, you can go to tabootalkback.com to hear other episodes. Go to Rumble, where we're putting them up now, and any place that you listen to podcasts. Mylan Bittenbender, thank you.
Thank you.
Amanda Jones. Yes, we have some really good talks, and I look forward to continuing them into the future. So please like, subscribe, do all that stuff, and help us out, because so far I could certainly put commercials into these podcasts. I don't do it because I think these kind of talks are so much better from the time you start to the time you end. I'll watch some podcasts. They'll be 40 minutes long, and they'll do a commercial in the middle, and I'm like, done with that. And I like either I'll fast forward to past it if I'm really into it, but otherwise, once I hit the commercial, all right, you've talked enough. So that's what I'm trying to do, and hopefully people out there enjoy that also. I
have a quick question.
Yeah.
Where would people go if they wanted to, in the comments, in comments that are read, ask a question?
I know if you go to podbean.com where you can find all the things they don't want you to talk about, you can leave comments there.
Okay.
And when I put it on Facebook, I put these up when I release them. I'll put them on Facebook for certainly our local area, and people that I'm know around here. They can leave comments right on that on the Facebook also.
Yeah,
if you don't like something, you can tell us that too. I don't censor. A lot of people say, well, you're just not going to use this comment or you'll delete it. I'm like, no, unless you're like totally belligerent and using some words that really don't want other kids that might look at this to see. If you want to express an opinion that's not the same as mine, not the same as Milan's, not the same as Amanda's, that's just fine. We leave it because that's what it's all about, is discourse. And if we cannot have difference of opinions, we are going to implode, just like I do believe South Haven, Michigan is kind of doing right now with all these different chat groups, all the divisiveness. So we got to stop that stuff. Yeah. So that's my preachy moment for the moment. But
preach it, Rob.
There you go. I'll get on my soapbox, and I got a bad foot, so I'll probably hurt it more trying to get off. So I just won't go up there anymore. But all the things they don't want you to talk about. Till next time, we'll see you then. All the Things They Don't Want You to Talk About podcast is part of the Rob Byrd Moondog Podcast Network. Go to tabootalkback.com for more information. Copyright 2024.